And Randall, I've sent you a text and a note. Um,
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Aloha, everyone. My name is Karine Hiramoto. I'm with James Campbell Company and BOMA Hawaii's 2021 Program Chair. I would like to thank Randall and JB for taking the time to present to our group today, as well as all of you for joining us. We want to give a special thanks to our platinum sponsors, ABM, Interstate Hawaii, Kavika's Painting, MD Restorations, Premier Restoration, and SP Plus. Thank you for all your continued support of BOMA Hawaii. Before I introduce our presenters and begin today's program, I'd like to announce our next BOMA Hawaii monthly meeting, which will be our annual disaster preparedness program to be held on Wednesday, April 14th at noon. We will be featuring climatologist Brandon Larson of Absolute Climo, who will be speaking to our group about the impacts of climate change and how that will influence the decisions that we make in the future. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. After their presentation today, we'll have a good amount of time to address any questions that you may have. So please feel free during the presentation or even after to type in your questions in the chat box and we'll be sure to address them for you. Randall Wakumoto is the program administrator for the City and County of Honolulu, Department of Facility Maintenance Stormwater Quality Division. Mr. Wakumoto has been doing engineering work with the City and County of Honolulu at the same branch for about 23 years. In his current position as program administrator, he is responsible for administering the city's stormwater management program and coordinating with the various city departments to ensure that they are complying with their stormwater requirements under the Federal Clean Water Act. In addition, his division is responsible and involved with managing and implementing a number of capital improvement program projects to help capture, treat, and eliminate the discharge of pollutants from entering the city's storm streams and nearshore waters. We also have Juli Beth JB Hinds, is the founding principal of Birchline Planning LLC. Ms. Hinds supports public and private sector clients with expertise in land use planning, water resources, program development, financial management, and public communication. Her experience includes over a decade serving as a municipal planning and stormwater service director. In addition, she has worked on the audit of the Maui County's zoning regulations and the ongoing update of Hawaii County's general plan. We're so honored to have both Randall and JB join us today and share with us their expertise. So thank you, Randall and JB.
No, thanks, Karine, for that that introduction. And yeah, so just like you mentioned, I'm Randall Wakumoto. I'm from the City and County of Honolulu, Department of Facility Maintenance. And in addition to managing the city's stormwater management program, we're also been tasked with kind of leading this charge as far as the possible establishment of a stormwater utility. And so right now we're currently doing the study. We've been engaging with a lot of our stakeholders and meeting with the public, really to kind of get some of that input and feedback as far as what a stormwater utility could look like here in the city and county of Honolulu. So at this time, maybe if JB, if we could maybe bring up your PowerPoint, we can kind of start
yeah,
that presentation.
Lily has graciously offered to get that going. There we go. Thank you, Lily.
Awesome, thank you. So as I mentioned, what we are currently undertaking is this stormwater utility study. And the whole idea behind this is really looking at stormwater as a resource and trying to treat it as a more comprehensive type program. So holistically looking at it from different aspects. And you can see here is just some examples of some of the things that gets involved with managing a stormwater program. This is what our Department of Facility Maintenance, or DFM, primarily is involved with, which is a lot of it is the maintenance of that storm drainage system. So you can see on the upper left corner is stream cleaning, which is to remove a lot of the floatables, a lot of the debris, some of the sediment that accumulates, and really trying to prevent that free flowage of water that goes to the streams. And you can see, obviously, today or yesterday actually was a good example of why it's really important of maintaining a lot of those streams, because if the during those large events when it starts to overtop, and because it might have a lot of that debris starts building up, is that's what when it starts to cause a lot of that localized flooding in a lot of these areas. So that's just one example, but you can see also as part of a stormwater management program, there's a lot of other things like education, water quality monitoring, cleaning of the storm drain system itself, implementing things like green infrastructure, which helps to capture and infiltrate a lot of that runoff into the ground to helping to recharge our groundwater supplies. And then of course, managing certain activities, whether it's construction, industrial, or commercial type things that happen that might contribute to some of that water pollution. Okay, next slide, please. So here in the city and county of Honolulu, it's and it's like that in a lot of other parts of the country, but obviously here in Oahu, it's mainly a separate system is what we're showing here. So we have both a wastewater system that collects from your toilets, your sinks, your bathtubs, and things like that, and that all goes to the sanitary sewer system, and that's treated as a separate source where they have underground pipes, and all of that goes into a wastewater treatment plant where the water gets actually treated before it discharges into the ocean, which is different than what the stormwater system is, in which case it's a separate uh, set of pipes and culverts and things that run underground. But what it's doing is this capturing the water as it's hitting on the ground surface, goes into these openings that then lead directly out into the ocean and into your stream. So none of that gets treated. All of that, whatever gets disposed or discharged into the storm drains, just goes directly out into the ocean. So that's really how here in Honolulu it's being treated. And it's both separate systems. Okay. Next slide, please. When we look at the Oahu's stormwater program, it's a very complex system. It's not really necessarily under one large department like you could imagine for our wastewater system that I just mentioned. That all falls under the city's Department of Environmental Services, who manages that sanitary wastewater system, including all the wastewater treatment plants as well as all the collection system. But for a stormwater program, there's not one agency that's responsible for all of it. It actually falls upon multiple departments, and that's what makes it kind of challenging and interesting at the same time, because we as a Department of Facility Maintenance, although we are tasked with administering the stormwater program, we rely on a lot of city departments to contribute and provide some of those services, whether it's issuing permits, building, grading, trenching, grubbing permits, and providing all the necessary inspections for when construction projects are being built. There's also our Department of Design and Construction, who handles all the major capital improvement projects, whether building a new facility, whether it's a fire station or police station or park. They manage a lot of those type of projects. But there's another host of departments, and that's why we're saying it's amongst 10 different city departments that manages this program island-wide. Roughly, when we looked at, we did a cost of service study. This was under one of our consultants at AECOM, who looked at all the organizations, looked at all the positions. And again, like I mentioned, it was pretty difficult because there's no one dedicated department that's solely responsible for stormwater. But you can see there was about 309 full-time employees that manages this stormwater program. And roughly about half of those are unfilled or vacant positions. So that's definitely going to be a big challenge. But when we looked at all that overall cost, what it came out to roughly was about $91.6 million annually, what the city is spending towards its managing its stormwater program. 70 million of that comes from the property taxes, so that's through the general funds. And then the other part of it is through the highway fund. So that's something that's being collected through the pump whenever you're filling your gas on your vehicles. A portion of that comes to the city, and of that, 22 million of that is being funded towards stormwater management purposes. Okay, next slide, please. And so at this point, what I'm going to do is turn it over to JB. She's our lead technical consultant that has helped us all the way from the beginning, all the way up to this point. And so she's going to be giving you pretty much all the meats and potatoes of all what we've been doing over the last 18 months during this time, and really providing you with a lot of the recommendations and what we've been gathering as far as we're developing this study.
Great, thank you, Randall. Meat, potatoes, and probably some vegetables too. So what we have been working on with DFM and with a wonderful stakeholder advisory group, which has included Melissa Pavlicek on behalf of BOMA Hawaii, is a feasibility study, if we could go to the next slide, please, that looked at two core questions. Number one, would a stormwater fee-based system for funding that program be feasible and desirable for the city and county? And if so, what would the rate be? And I'll talk a little bit about what a utility is and how that would work. So we've been working on that, and I would encourage all of you to please visit our website if you haven't before. It's stormwaterutilityoahu.org, where we have our summary report, all of the agendas and materials from all of our stakeholder advisory group meetings, and a wealth of other background information on this process. So if we could go to the next slide, please. The stakeholder advisory group, working with DFM, has recommended that the city and county advance a proposal for a stormwater utility, and that in doing so, the fee would be set at about $4.85 per 1,000 square feet of impervious surface per month. We'll talk about what that means. So we have some core recommendations, but fundamentally the recommendation is that this should move forward. So what we want to talk about today is what the implications are of that and the timing of that for building and property managers. So if we can go to the next slide. Something else that we call your attention to in the feasibility study and our process are the core values for a stormwater utility. This was work done by the stakeholder advisory group around we've got to provide these services. How do we want our utility and our services to function? What are the core values for that? Clean water, of course, was one, and healthy and safe environment. But our stakeholder advisory group has prioritized community involvement and transparency and reporting around how funds are collected, how they're spent, what citizens are seeing for their money as core values of our program moving forward. So on our next slide, how would a stormwater utility work? Some of you, I'm sure, have heard a presentation before or are somewhat familiar with this, and others might not be. So let's go through a couple of the fundamentals of how this works. So a stormwater utility basically changes how the city and county pays for stormwater. As Randall showed you, currently about $70 million per year is a transfer from the general fund, from property taxes on taxable property. The other $22 million is coming from the highway fund, reflecting, excuse me, the share of that cost that's attributable to our public roadway system. In a stormwater utility, you use fees instead of property taxes. So it's basically, instead of taking property tax transfer, it's a fee that is charged to all properties, whether taxable or non-taxable. And that means everyone from the federal government down to the city and county, the state of Hawaii, and all properties, regardless of tax status, would pay a fee. In this kind of fee-based program, all revenues would be segregated into a special fund of the city and county. The fees that are charged must be related to the total cost of stormwater services, and any expenditures from that special fund must be demonstrably related to providing stormwater service. So it is a segregated and restricted special fund. In addition, anytime a community charges a fee for service for stormwater, just like your water bill, if you implement water conservation at a property, your water bill should go down. In a stormwater utility, credits, financial credits must be available for actions that reduce stormwater runoff from a property. So those are some fundamental characteristics of this. It's really changing how the city and county pays for its stormwater services. What this proposal would not do is establish a new agency or department. All of that work would remain under the Department of Facility Maintenance with allied work by allied departments, but it does not create anything like a Board of Water Supply or a new department or division. It also, and this is critically important for all of you and your constituents, it does not affect land use regulation in any shape or form. It does not affect lot coverage, setbacks, parking requirements. That all remains with zoning. A stormwater utility does not change land use regulation. So let's go on, if we can go on to our next slide, please. The fees, and we'll go into this in some detail, are based on impervious area. So that's the sum of your building footprint plus your parking, other paved or hardened surfaces. How do you figure that out? We actually have really good satellite mapping for all of Oahu. Our Department of Planning and Permitting keeps the building footprints. Satellites tell us the rest, and that's available at a parcel level island-wide. So keep that impervious area in mind as we go forward. Really quickly, stormwater utilities are very, very common in certain regions of the United States and have been upheld by the courts consistently. That use of impervious cover as a basis for the fee has been upheld very consistently by courts across the country. In addition, the U.S. Clean Water Act was amended to require federal facilities to pay duly adopted local stormwater fees. So that means that the Department of Defense and other federal entities on Oahu would be required to pay their fee. Hawaii's legislature authorized the counties to charge a fee in 2016. That was an action that allowed each county voluntarily to set up a utility, create those segregated special funds, and charge a fee. So why do communities do this? Nationally, the experience has been that switching to a fee instead of relying on those property taxes that can be where there's lots of competing demands provides stable and predictable funding. It allows carrying over fund balances from year to year so that you can do long-term planning and investment in your stormwater infrastructure. It greatly facilitates permit compliance because you know what your revenues will be and when you can take certain actions to reduce pollution and improve your system. It also promotes much greater transparency around how much do we spend and on what to manage our stormwater system. When it's got to be accounted for in a special fund, you really get a greater degree of information and control over what's being spent. Creates a lot of public awareness. When people get a stormwater bill, they really start to tune into stormwater and also to what they can do to reduce their bills. That creates a clear link between the beneficial actions that property owners can take and their financial reward for those credits. So on our next slide, how do we calculate the fees? It's it's more straightforward than you'd think. Basically, thanks to the satellites, the square feet, the actual square feet of impervious surface are counted up, and that is the basis for your fee. So you take that number, divide it by 1,000, multiply it by the rate, and that, for the most part, is your fee. Vacant properties do not pay stormwater utility fees. Unless you have 300 or more square feet, you would not pay a fee regardless of taxable value. It's really based on how much impervious area is there, because that's our proxy for the runoff generated and the demand on the system. Things that don't affect fees include how big your parcel is, how much of the lot is covered, the percent of the lot that covered, it's just about this square feet, the type of land use, building heights, taxable value, permitting status. Those do not affect your fee, and we'll talk a little bit about why some of those are the case. It's really just how much impervious area is there. That's the basis for your fee. And then, as we'll talk about, less any credits that you obtain. So on the next slide, one of the most common questions we get, very relevant to BOMA members, why do tall buildings pay the same thing as short buildings? Why would a 20,000 square foot building that is 5 stories high pay the same as a 20,000 square foot building that's 1 story? And the answer is really stormwater runoff, how much water comes off in a rainstorm like Oahu went through yesterday, is a function of building footprint, not height. The height does not affect how much runoff there is, how much strain there is on the city's infrastructure systems. And it's also important to know that typically it's much easier and less expensive for 1-2-story buildings to implement credit projects. Usually they're in lower density settings than it is for some of our tall buildings in Waikiki, where your land is limited, your opportunities for credits might be limited. But in stormwater utilities, to keep that relationship between how much runoff and how much you pay, tall buildings pay the same as shorter buildings if that footprint is the same. On the next slide, another very common question we get is, why would the dry side pay the same as the windward side? Shouldn't it matter how much rainfall? When these rainfall patterns have been evaluated, the storm totals, it may rain more frequently on the windward side, but the actual storm totals are not terribly different. The other thing is, as you went through yesterday, storms aren't really interested in what our pretty maps of precipitation say. We can get a very strong storm that hits the dry side. That infrastructure has to be ready to handle it. So between those two factors and the administrative cost of trying to parse out a bill by how much rain is typical, that is not a recommended approach to establishing stormwater fees. So that's all nice on our next slide, but how much would Oahu properties be charged? So where our study, the cost study that our colleagues at AECOM did and our analysis have landed, is at a rate in the neighborhood of, excuse me, $4.85 per 1,000 square feet of impervious per month. What we do in stormwater utilities for properties under, in this case, about 7,000 square feet of impervious, is to, because the fee differences would be so small, we tend to group them into what we call tiers, or groupings with similar amounts of impervious surface. And for properties with 7,000 or more square feet of impervious, probably the majority of your clients and your properties, we just take the square feet of impervious divided by 1,000 times that rate. Below that, we have a monthly tier, and a typical single family, so think of a new build out in Kapolei, the typical single family would pay about $17 per month. And then we have lower tiers for smaller buildings. Think of maybe a small single family in Eva Village would be down in the $7.28 a month, maybe $12.13 at those lower tiers. On the next slide, we've been very careful to look at where that would put Oahu cost-wise relative to other peer cities in the continental US. That rate would put Oahu basically between Boulder and Mission, Kansas, and also closer to Philadelphia, where the rates were just increased. So that 17 a month is probably it's in about the middle tier of cities. It's well below Seattle, well below many of the coastal Carolina communities that where North Carolina, South Carolina, you see very high stormwater fees. Above some of the Great Lakes cities where they tend to have had fees in place for a long time, but they're relatively low. So here are some sample bills. And I want to say at the outset that I'm here as a resource. We can look up properties for you. We can help whatever would be helpful for you for considering this and working with your properties. Here are a couple of examples. That's an apartment building with 34,000 square feet of impervious. That fee would be about $164 per month before credits. Again, the single family residential, that's a bigger one of about 4,200. So it would be in the next higher tier. That fee would be about $22 per month. On the right is an industrial building not too far from the airport that has almost 100,000 square feet of impervious. Again, not much green space, it's industrial, $447 a month before credits. On the next slide, I want to walk through a couple of buildings that I hope these are relevant. We're all pretty familiar with the Pan Am building. near the Ala Moana Mall. So how would that fee be calculated? In this case, we've got a parcel of about 1.5 acres with about 1/4 acre of green space, and that's both roof and ground surface green space. So we take the building impervious area there, which is 54,000 square feet. We add other impervious area, which is basically some plazas and patios of 538. And then, very important, any roadways within a property that are open to public travel or are otherwise public, are deducted. Those are exempt from a fee. We don't have any roadways within the property of the Pan Am building, so their adjusted impervious area for building is about 54,832 square feet. Divide that by 1,000 and multiply by 485, and their monthly base stormwater fee would be about $266. Now, with credits for stormwater treatment, rainwater capture, that could go as low as $160 per month, but it's a tall building without a lot of land area. Those reductions are a little bit harder to achieve when we're in a downtown setting than they are in some of our lower density settings. But there's your base rate and how that's calculated. And then with the maximum credit, it would go down as low as about $160 per month. So let's look at an example where we do have what we call quasi-public roadways within a property. So here's a self-storage out in Kapolei. This is near the water park. This is a parcel of about 10 acres with, it's got almost 2 acres, 1.75 acres of permeable area. So landscaping and other green space around it. So we take the building area, 125,000, typical for a big box. Parking lots and other impervious is 175,000, and subtract out the portions of the roadways that go through that property that our system has identified. They're publicly traveled, they function as public roadways, they are exempt from a fee. They would not be charged a fee because they provide that public service, so everyone pays to support the roads. So in this case, the adjusted impervious area for the bill would be about 368,000 square feet. Divide by 1,000, multiply by 485, and their base bill is $1,788 per month. Now, this is a site where there's a lot of room to do things that would get credits. For example, implementing bioretention, green roof, permeable pavers in parking lots. Great candidates here. Rainwater capture off of the roof, flat roof, lower density, easier to do. With the maximum credits, this property, if they treat an inch of runoff over their impervious surfaces, could be all the way down to just north of $1,000 per month. So with the credits, there's some big opportunities to reduce those base stormwater fees. Again, it's easier somewhat in the suburban settings, but there are a lot of different ways to get those stormwater fees down. And we'll talk a little bit about billing and credits in just a second. Quickly, the next slide. If these fees are charged, provide stable funding to the program, what are the benefits to citizens? What do we see for our fees? Priorities in the budgets that went into the rate study are the stream maintenance. Adding 2 crews with their equipment is probably the top priority to be able to fund that sustainably. And yesterday was a good evidence, as Randall noted, of why that's so important. Additional customer-facing staff for site inspections and compliance. This is something we heard from the business community, and that Randall and his team, Tanya Ketza and their team, have been hearing. We need more people to come out and help us with compliance, help us figure out how to get our site in compliance with pollution prevention. That is another priority that is in the budget. Another is to have the funding and the staff to leverage some of the significant financial resources and grants available. I was at a webinar this morning with the Water Environment Federation. There are 2 more new funding streams coming through the Clean Water State Revolving Fund that could really benefit Oahu and get some work done. You got to have people and matching funds to leverage that money. It's an example of where you need to have money to make money. So that's another really top priority, priority from the mayor's office too, to start leveraging and bringing in that money. And we do have on our next slide very quickly, a budget for community partnerships and for getting green infrastructure out into the community through partnerships with private and public sector partners. I want to make sure we talk, if Lily, if you would go 2 slides ahead on billing and credits. I know this is mission critical for all of you as part of BOMA. How do we get bills, or if we could go back 1, sorry about that. How do we deal with billing for multi-tenant buildings? The answer is whatever works. When a stormwater utility billing system is set up, generally the owner of a condo property has an opportunity to say either send the bill to a master association or to set it up that individual condo owners get a bill. How you allocate the bill among property owners is truly up to the owner and manager. This is a big lift when a billing system is put in place, but the message that's really important for all of you and your fellow members is there's no requirement that bills be allocated a certain way, so long as the bill for the overall property is paid. I can tell you lots of war stories from being someone who launched the stormwater utility, and we had a ton of condo associations in our community. Some divided the share of the common impervious area among all the property owners. Some just put it on the master association bill. Multi-tenant buildings, again, same thing. Some said, nope, he gets a water bill, send the bill to him individually. Others said, nah, I'll work it into the leases, just send it to a master association. It's something good to start thinking about now, but just know that there's no one way this has to happen. It can be worked out to work with your properties. That's a very, very important aspect of getting it set up. Credits, Lily, if you wouldn't mind advancing. It has been the recommendation here that all properties be eligible to apply for credits. That is unusual in many communities in the US. Credits are limited to non-residential properties. Our stakeholder group, DFM leadership said, no way, we want everybody to be able to participate, put in beneficial projects, and get a financial reward from that. The basis for those credits, and as I said, the maximum we propose is up to a 60% credit, so only paying 40% of your fee, would be consistent with the city's existing standards of managing the first inch of runoff over your property. So what does that look like? Lily, if we can go to the next. Basically, if you have an existing stormwater system on the property, that will be eligible for a credit, regardless of when it was put in. The credit would be based on how much of that inch of runoff over my property am I treating. So if you have the opportunity to implement things like green roof or permeable pavement, if you're redoing your parking lot, know that those investments will count towards a credit if and when the stormwater fees are charged. That's also, we really want to get that message out there. And anything you're installing for compliance with the city's 1-inch requirement, that will count. So we're not considering if it's to meet a regulation, that's fine. Doesn't matter the why you put it in, just how much runoff are you managing. That'll be the basis for your credit. On the next slide, in addition to that, there would be some options for organizations to get a credit. Churches and schools can get credits for things like education or hosting events. But the bulk of the credit, I think the most important for BOMA managers, is that runoff management credit. Here's an example of how that would work. This is your basic Safeway shopping center out in Salt Lake. Their fee would be about $11.67 a month. If they did the maximum, treated the inch of runoff off for the whole site, they'd go all the way down to $4.67 per month. We've also done some calculations of, well, what am I paying today in property tax that actually goes towards funding stormwater services? That's information that we've been sharing with our stormwater committee, and we have a lot of information on that we can answer questions about. We have looked at, okay, how much are taxable properties paying today towards stormwater fees? It's interesting that for a lot of commercial properties, it's sort of an equivalent to what they would pay in stormwater fees. So just a couple of more things, and we really look forward to your questions. Lily, if you would advance that, this is just a couple more examples of what would the fees look like if folks got that maximum credit. On the next slide, this is mostly relevant to organizations, but if you're managing a property for an educational institution or for an organization, there are going to be some either rebates or credits available for providing ongoing education, possibly for enhancing tree canopy. That's something to be thinking about. And those properties that already have their own separate storm system permit, which includes some of Hawaii Pacific's properties, they will also get a credit based on their compliance with a separate permit. Next slide shows a couple of hardship provisions that would be for low-income households and for our smallest landowning nonprofits. Their fees are recommended to be capped. We also, I think relevant to BOMA, our stakeholder group has recommended some serious discussions with our friends at the Environmental Services about the overall affordability of wastewater, which is a big bill, plus stormwater, and how that works for some of our businesses and households. So what happens next? The proposal for a utility requires 2 city council actions. We want to emphasize this. The first that is likely to be advanced this spring is simply to set up a special fund within the city and county's accounts so that Randall and his team can begin tracking all revenues, which are fairly modest at this point, things like fees, permit fees, start tracking those revenues and expenditures and really beginning to segregate those stormwater costs from the general fund. But that does not involve any money, and that does not establish a bill. The second step through City Council would be the adoption of an ordinance that charges a fee. That ordinance also would set the key credit policies, exemptions, including those quasi-public roads, and hardship. And again, it does not establish a separate authority or department. A lot of discussion that we hope you will be engaged with will take place around the timing of fees. We've just come through a major economic crisis. It's not over yet. So there'll be a lot of discussion about when those fees would take effect. It is not foreseeable that a bill would be charged anywhere before early 2023 at the earliest. It takes a long time to put a billing system in place and work all this out. But when might those be phased in? Another discussion that we're starting to have is, should those fees be phased in? My colleague Lawrence Vandertak at Jacobs, who is my teammate on the technical side, he and I are very familiar with utilities that have phased in fees over time. So the first year, communities would charge 50% of the bill and then gradually ramp that up so that their ratepayers and customers have a chance to implement credits, get ahead of it, build it into their budget. So we'll be talking about that. We also will be talking about whether there are certain economic recovery benchmarks that need to be met before fees are implemented. And last but not least, there's been very strong discussion on this issue of, we pay property taxes now, 70 million of that funds stormwater. If a fee is charged, is there some balancing out of that, either over the short or long term? So we call that our revenue neutrality discussion, and it definitely will come up as this process moves ahead. Really quickly, here is a schedule. Of course, last year we had a glorious schedule too. We're doing a lot of technical updates, so you can just flip through all this. And we're working, the credit policy development will be later this year. The bill for the special fund may advance sooner. The bill for the ordinance to charge the fee probably later this year. And then implementation, again, it's hard to see any bills being sent out before calendar 2023. So that is some ways off, but certainly the discussion is happening now. And finally, a couple things for building owners and managers to sort of get ahead of this. Again, we're here as a resource to you anytime. We greatly appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. Please follow and sign up for updates on our project website. We have a ton of resources there. Neighborhood boards, Randall, I think we're looking at May perhaps for briefings to neighborhood boards.
Yeah, maybe actually even some of it in April, if possible.
April and possibly May. We, as someone who I work with private clients, I work with stormwater utilities, I want to suggest all of you over the next year or so, find the grading plan for your property if you have one. Check on your impervious surface and check with our team if you've got issues, and really start, think about possible projects. Think about if you were going to redo the parking lot, maybe think about checking in with one of our local folks about doing bioretention or doing some permeable pavement. It's a great time to think about getting ahead of that, because any actions you're taking will count. We're not going to start the clock when the billing starts. So beneficial things you do today can benefit you in the future. And please be in communication with us. We've had, Melissa has been a tremendous resource and voice for BOMA on our stakeholder advisory group. We just greatly value her and all of you. Your ideas on billing, on credits, on applications, whatever you think of, we would just love to have that feedback from you. So thank you for your patience. I know it's a lot of information, and we really look forward to your questions and discussion. Corinne, I think you're muted.
Thank you, JP. So I just want to say thank you so much, and please go ahead and type in your questions into the chat box. That was a great presentation because it answered my list of questions, but I will elaborate on one or ask a question on one of the items that you touched based on. So, like for real property taxes, there are exemptions for nonprofit or governmental properties, and you did touch base on that there'll be a lower cost. But would they be able to file for exemptions? And does their cost different to what their impervious area is?
Right. Great question, Randall. I'll just start with this one. First of all, the only truly exempt properties, the only actual exemption would be public and quasi-public roads. Again, roads that are either public or open to travel, and vacant properties that have less than 300 square feet. Every other property pays a fee. Government properties pay a fee, all of them, state, local, federal, and nonprofits. What we would do, what our stakeholder advisory group has recommended is to cap the fee for nonprofit organizations that are responsible for their utility bills, and their fee would be capped at 0.5% of their demonstrated annual revenue. So we've had the Roman Catholic Archdiocese has helped us think through this. We have examples from Montgomery County, Maryland, where that's done. And it creates a cap on the fee for 501c3s based on their annual revenue. So you're not, so that you make sure you're accommodating that small parish with a historic property. And then low-income households who are responsible for that bill would likewise, they would pay the tier 1 fee, which is $2.43 per month. So those are the caps, but the
Okay.
only thing that's exempt is those public roads and vacant properties.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
And I can add to that as well.
Yeah.
Maybe mention, unless there are some legislation bills that are introduced, which we are tracking one that got introduced by at the state legislature. It's House Bill 1060, but in that bill, it was specifically to exempt state properties from paying a stormwater fee. They did amend the bill, in which case now currently that's going through the legislature. It is showing that it's exempting just the State Department of Transportation harbors and airports. But that's currently what's there right now. And we've provided testimony on that bill, and we're continuing to track that, but that is currently what's, as far as any type of exemptions, that's
Okay.
currently what's being proposed.
Being looked at. Okay.
And
Okay, thank you.
that would affect everyone. Everyone would pay more to exempt those. I think the Water Environment Federation is actually going to be, we don't have a link yet, but we're going to be doing a webinar on what other states have done to accommodate for transportation facilities in a more limited manner. Everyone you exempt makes everybody else pay more.
Okay.
So that's a challenge. And the federal
Right, right.
government is unequivocally must pay. They can get credits, but our Clean Water Act says federal government facilities must pay.
Okay, great. Thank you for the clarification. So it looks like you folks are looking at implementing, or hopefully if everything goes well in 2023, the fiscal year 2023, is the rates that you folks are proposing now in the pro forma to be flat for a few years, or do you folks foresee having some increases in the rates in future years, I should say?
AB, did you want to take that one? No. Okay. So yeah, as far as what we're proposing as part of the utility study is that we were proposing it to be at that rate for at least 6 years, for the
Wow,
duration of that. So the idea was that, at least to be able to start ramping it up, because we expect that we're not going to get 100% collections in the beginning. And obviously, as things start to ramp up, then we'll be able to see what collections come in. And at that same time, during that 6-year period, there is a plan that the city could start issuing some type of a revenue generating bonds in order to help subsidize and pay for a lot of the larger capital improvements. So then it kind of spreads out the cost over a period of time. But after that 6 years, then we would reevaluate and see if that is something that needs to be adjusted. But at least during that 6-year period, it'll be fixed.
Okay, great. That's good to know.
And that's important for a lot of reasons, not only for, excuse me, your property owners, but redoing the rate study is a big lift. It's expensive. Knowing that you can plan rather than tinkering with rates is generally the recommended approach, and certainly would be recommended here.
Right, right. Yeah, for many of us, we like to plan ahead. So that's great to know for at least 6 years. It'll take us to the end of the decade. But we have a question related to the last question. What are properties that do not use the municipal stormwater system? Or what about properties, excuse me, that do not use the municipal stormwater system?
I can start with that one. Great question and very important. It comes up at all of our discussions. The island-wide cost of service goes well beyond the actual physical catch basin and storm drain system, and it includes things like maintaining the streams that are detached from the city systems. It includes a lot of other measures, including water quality monitoring, that extend well beyond the collection system. And so it's really more about funding the island-wide system of very different infrastructure, including those streams and the other sort of natural area management that has to be done. So generally properties that are off the system, there's often the argument, well, I'm not connected to it, why should I pay? The other big issue is the roads. Everybody touches the public roadway system. And so that's part of that stormwater fee, is to manage the runoff from the roads that we all share. And for that reason, all of the properties, Oahu is a little unique in that it's a truly island-wide system. So all of properties, all impervious cover would pay.
Yeah, and what I could also add to what JB just mentioned, and it was in her presentation, she talked about that there's other opportunities for partnerships and grants. And a lot of what currently, because we're kind of on a fixed fee through the property taxes and it's through general funds, that most of what we're having to expend all of our efforts are just confined to what's the city responsibility and jurisdiction. But with a stormwater utility, it does open up the opportunities to do things that might be beyond that portion. So it could be in upper headwaters, let's say, or providing assistance for other landowners, like within the agricultural industry, because we see that that's being a big source of where a lot of the pollution may be coming from. So, you know, it provides that grant opportunities, partnerships to be able to work with other landowners as you get a stormwater utility, because you can leverage the funding and being able to use some of the savings through grants or other opportunities to work with these other partnerships, which is not currently available for the city at this point in time.
Thank you. Thank you, Randall. Okay, I think there are not any other questions, but that was great and super informative. Thank you very much to the both of you. That's going to conclude our program for today. And, you know, again, a big mahalo to Randall and JB. Please, we'll all get on that website and gather more information and maybe reaching out to you as needed. So thank you for offering that.
Again, thank you for your time and for Melissa's participation. We really are here as a resource. If you have questions, if you've got a question about a property or something, we don't hesitate to reach out. We're really glad to be able to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate that. So we hope everyone has a great rest of the week, and we hope to see everyone at our disaster preparedness meeting on April 14th. Thank you.
No, thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.